I feel that people are seeing Bitcoin increasingly as a conservative investment, and they're not saying that about Ether or Cardano or any of the other coins. Those are not conservative investments. So I just feel like that fits in the zeitgeist where the whole world is looking for safety. Like, what is safe? What is permanent? What is universal? What is apolitical? And Bitcoin fits that.
Tuur, I think we've been recording shows about Bitcoin and this entire space since, I don't even know, 2016,
I want to say 2016, yeah.
yeah, maybe even 2015. I don't know, but it's been a long time. So great to have you back. I've learned so much from you through the years, and now is no different. And you have a new report that you just published, How to Position Yourself for the Bitcoin Boom in 2025. This is a free download that people will have a link in the show notes that if people want to download this and read it, it is amazing. It's about 24 pages. You go into depth. We're going to cover a lot of that on the show, but yeah, what was the impetus for writing yet another banger of a report?
Yeah, I'm glad you like it. Well, it was twofold. One, it was at some point we were just talking, I work with Unchained here in Austin, and we were just talking about, our general collaboration and doing some events and things like that. And they were like asking like, "Oh, have you considered writing a new report?" And I was like, "Oh, actually not, because I always do them in the bear market. But give me some time and I'll think about it." And I did have that feeling of kind of disagreeing with the consensus, which
Oh,
is usually a good time to put something out. And it seems like there was a kind of a consensus that 100,000 is nice. We should be happy with that. Let's just accept it's a 4-year cycle. So we're gonna go back down and we'll take some profits here and call it a day. And I was like, I don't think so. I
yeah.
haven't seen a mania. Like, it just, my gut was like, I think there's a lot more here. So it was a great motivation to dig in again and actually look at the data and see what comes out.
It's funny that you start off with that because I completely agree with you. Having been through a couple bull markets, this right now doesn't feel anything like a speculative mania or anything that is like the past cycles at this point in time from the halving, right? If anything, it feels somewhat bearish right now as far as just like almost like nothing even happened. I think from,
Even though the price has quadrupled in
yeah,
2 years and a half.
yeah. I mean, the previous cycles always had this speculative blow off that usually lasted what, 6 to 9 months, where it was just the price was literally raging 3 to 5% what felt like every day for like 6 months straight. And we haven't seen anything like that.
No, I think whoever's buying is probably like hate buying right now. Like they kind of feel like they have to own some, and they don't like Trump, but he's like, you got to diversify somehow. It's not at that stage where people feel like this is the be all end all answer to all, all problems. It's not there. And it's an institutional cycle. I don't know if you agree, but I think this is the
Yeah.
real institutional cycle. I don't think retail is really in this market yet.
Wow. Yeah. Your report, kind of starting off there, the narrative or the talking point is whales are selling. But in your report, you kind of say, you're not saying the opposite, but your report suggests that whales are holding rather than capitulating and signaling a mid bull sentiment. Talk to us a little bit about this and what metrics you're looking at that are suggesting that.
Yeah, so the hodler net position change is a metric I like to look at. And it basically looks at all the coins in aggregate, but weighted for their age. Are we seeing net hodling, or are we seeing net moving of coins, which usually indicates selling? And so you see these spikes in the graph.
Hmm.
And usually in an early bull market, there's just no movement whatsoever. The whales are just stoically holding, and we have seen a few spikes down, but no moves really above 100,000 in the past 6 to 9 months. Yeah, so you see those little spikes, and actually in my video presentation, which was a little bit after the report, there was another spike down, and that was that 80,000. The one that people were
Yeah.
talking about, 80,000 Bitcoin being sold, which led to I think it was only a 3% move in the price.
Yeah.
Incredible. And actually, I looked up the Bitfinex hack back in the day. I think that was 160,000 coins.
Hmm.
And even that, like, yeah, the market had a little sell-off, but it didn't do anything substantial. Also, I think you have to keep in mind that there may be Bitcoin whales that are moving coins not because they're selling, but because they're seeing the sailor strategy opportunity of, hey, if I put my coins in a vehicle here, we can now use leverage to increase our stash. And for the first time in a kind of in a legally legitimate way. I don't want to put all my money on that, like, oh, it's totally that. This time is different. I still think that there is probably some profit taking among whales as well because they're accustomed to the 4-year cycle. We're above the previous all-time high. Like it feels like a nice time to do that. I'm curious what your take is because you're also really deep in the Bitcoin space and talking to people. Like, why do you think these older coins are moving a bit?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems kind of weird that you're seeing such large blocks kind of come onto the market the way that they're coming onto the market because it appears they're going into the spot markets, which, for all intents and purposes means they want you to see that they're selling. They want you to see it kind of getting ready to be released and then wanting you to position yourself for that event. And that's kind of odd, right? Because if you really wanted to mask this, you would do it as much over the counter and behind the scenes and as slowly as possible if you didn't want the market to know. So I find that quite head scratching. I don't have an answer for it, but if you were going to pick through the incentives of why somebody would be doing that, I guess they're trying to signal to the market and maybe go into some type of derivative to catch after the move to be more levered in the long-term play, call it, a 1-year derivative or a 2-year derivative on the underlying. So I don't know, but it's very different than what we saw in previous bull runs. And I think so much of it is just to your point that you made earlier. The institutions are here and Wall Street is here in full steam. And they seem to be kind of pulling out a lot of the playbooks that they've used in markets for decades, which is if you want to acquire the underlying, you do fancy stuff like this, I guess.
You make good points. Yeah, and it's true that we don't really know. I mean, I do think there's blockchain analysis that's fairly good, but still, we don't really know where these whales are. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like what if you're a Chinese whale and like, you've kind of had some visitors from the government. They're like, hey, we want you to have a good future, but also, we're looking to acquire Bitcoin. So, maybe we can work something out where you ostensibly sell a whole bunch of Bitcoin, etc. I mean, who knows? Like yeah,
Yeah.
there's so many possible scenarios. But I do think in the aggregate, you do got to pay attention to this. If we're going to see bigger blocks move, like two moves of like 200,000 coins, I think that's often a sign that the whales know something is up. But
Mhm.
I don't feel like we're there yet.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's so many people running around saying, well, here we are. This is, we're coming up on the point in time of the 4-year cycle that you sell your coins and you go away for a year and a half and then you come back. And if there's one thing I've learned in Bitcoin, it's when you make a really simple, like, decision like that, or you think you've figured it out, it seems to always figure out a way to prove you wrong and to change and to adjust. And I have
Yeah,
no idea what to do right here.
I think that's why I put out the report because I have that same feeling, and I was wrong back in the day in I think it was 2016, late 2016, early 2017 maybe, where we were like between 1,500 and $3,000. So it was a new all-time high.
Yeah.
And people had this like mental block. Me too. It was like, I think this is too much, and people who are ignorant are getting in. And I remember even selling some Bitcoin, just thinking like, oh, you never know. And then we went to 20,000.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of like bullish predictions of like, I guess Samsung is probably the only one who has like very bullish prediction and a short-term prediction. Whereas most people are like, oh yeah, 1 million Bitcoin by 2030.
Hmm.
And most predictions seem to be hovering around like 200,000, which is, yeah, it's a 2x from here. But I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, we could
I'm
move
very
along.
happy to have egg on my face, when it happens and be exposed or whatever that I was way too bullish. But I do feel like we could tack on another 18 months possibly to this cycle. Maybe, 8 to 18 months or something like that and have a real blowout. Because also the capital is now concentrated in Bitcoin. Like, yeah, there is an altcoin. We're seeing that bubble up again, these coins, in my opinion. But people are so ignorant they were in previous cycles. They know Bitcoin is the game in town. And also, if you have appetite for risk, go at it, right? In the Bitcoin space, any kind of risk, it's there for you. You name it, you can buy it. So you don't have to go to these pump and dumps.
Yeah, there's no speculative mania that I'm seeing whatsoever compared to previous cycles that give you that big giant sell off is because people made a bunch of fast money. They don't really realize why they made it. They just followed their cousin who told them about it and then they bought in and it ripped 100% and then they sold and that's the collapse of it all.
Mm.
I'm not seeing that right now, but we'll see. For people listening, you can
Yeah, right.
how timid we both are, having been through, seen a lot.
You got to stay humble. Like you just can't copy paste the previous cycle. You never can.
You definitely can't. Hey, you bring up in your report this risk of custodial confiscation by governments. And this is a risk that, I'm looking at the incentives of the government. More and more spending, more and more reliance on debasement of the currency. I look at the social construct of society, and there's a huge population that literally just look at the government like, oh, you're going to print some money and just mail it to me? Yeah, that's what I want you to do, without the thought of the long-term consequence. They don't care about the long-term. They just need relief now.
Yeah.
So the politicians that are representing a lot of this population that need the relief now, I don't see them looking at any of this as if they're going to rein in and perform austerity or anything like that. So with that being the setup, and then you're looking at the world potentially moving to this new form of money, and you look at the consolidation of the coins into the hands of institutions that are custodying very large swaths of this quote unquote new money. Walk us through how you think some of this could potentially unfold. Is it a high risk? What are the probabilities that you're kind of putting on some of this? Walk us through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of why this risk was considered to be so abstract and, far, far away is that most people had a bit of, I guess they would underestimate the craftiness of government in terms of, coming up with a narrative that they can sell to the public. Because the image was, oh yeah, confiscation means the government barges in and it just kind of yanks 80% of the coins out of Coinbase, puts it on their own account, and there we go. What are you gonna do? We have the guns, you don't. And then people would be like, no, this is America, that would never happen. But look at what Trump did with the tariffs. He wanted to increase taxes. He wanted some kind of VAT system like they have in Europe, but he couldn't sell that. He couldn't push it through the legislature probably. But so what he did was call it tariffs, but it's almost like the net same effect. He has a whole bunch of new tax revenues that are by and large paid by, it looks like it's going to be, American consumers that are going to pay for that. It doesn't really seem like, I could be wrong, but it doesn't really seem like international producers are lowering their prices because I think oftentimes they just have very thin margins themselves. They just can't.
Yeah.
So just to see how they pull that off and sold it, it's just the reality now. Like it's something that people would think was impossible 6 months ago, and now we're just living it. And then just last week, it was like, oh yeah, and by the way, Intel got a lot of bailouts or a lot of stimulus money during COVID, so we're going to take 10%. And initially, Trump seemed to say like, oh, we paid good money for it. It's a great investment. And now he's tweeting like, isn't it amazing? We got it for free. We just took it. And I think the market is a little delusional to pump in the Intel stock, like as if this is great news for Intel, that investors are diluted and that there's a risk of even more of that happening to Intel or other companies in the near future. I think that's just a short-term kind of short circuit in people's minds. But so, yeah, I think that's the reality. And so when you think about how Bitcoin confiscation would happen, I think it could be similar, where all of a sudden the government moves, all these companies are going to be publicly traded, so they can just kind of take stock in them and say it's a sovereign wealth fund they're building. And then what probably you want to do as a government is to try and use those assets as collateral to then borrow against it. Because ultimately, a government doesn't really care so much about cash. Like they don't want to be debt free necessarily. They just want to be able to service their debt, which means just issue more of it. And if you're losing credibility internationally in the way that you've always done it with the bond markets, which clearly is the case, bond markets are, in my opinion, are strong in a strong bear market, corrected for inflation worldwide. So you got to come up with other ways to do it. And I think also we have to keep in mind local governments can also start,
Oh, yeah.
coming up with schemes like this. There's no limit almost. The advantage of Bitcoin, of course, is that it's highly auditable and you can move things around so that there is still time to kind of position yourself for this new reality. But I think you have to it's just another risk factor that you have to now really add to the list if you're a Bitcoin investor. Because I said this to Connor in a podcast just yesterday that, of course, we all know the risk in Bitcoin is not spread homogeneously, but I think it'll be the same for confiscation. There's not going to be I don't think, a blank out ban of Bitcoin. That seems impossible with the Trump administration, given how bullish all these people are in the administration. But I do think certain vehicles could just have more risk than others.
Mm. It's interesting that you kind of use the Intel as an example of how government could just dilute existing shareholders in a stealthy kind of way, then borrow against the shares through a sovereign wealth fund. And most shareholders or the public or people covering it, I mean, I would think that your typical American wouldn't even really understand
Hmm.
like what took place to be outraged or upset about with respect to something.
Because the story is we're partners now. Like the
Yeah.
U.S. government and the American people and Intel, we're partners now.
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody in Bolivia, if a Bolivian government had done that, we would be like, this is confiscation, this is nationalization of the industry, and we all know there's examples, there's studies of like oil companies when the government owns 50% of an oil company or a majority share, their production goes down by about 50% on average. Like they just become,
Like
and
Gazprom is like an example, or
there's several examples. You have Venezuela as well. You just kind
yeah.
of compare it to pure private play oil
Wow.
companies. And of course, because they have a board with market people, they don't have bureaucrats on the board. We saw it in Belgium too. Like the government nationalized the telecom company and the postal company, and those shares are just, and even the national, that's a funny example actually. The central bank of Belgium had lots of gold and the government came on board as a partner. And so now, even to this day, you can buy shares in the Belgian National Bank and have a claim to all the gold, but the shares are trading at way below NAV, way below NAV, because people don't fool themselves to think that they could actually, pull that gold out.
This is such a salient point because this is something that I've talked about on stage at different conferences and whatnot, but I've always left it very generic as to the government's going to eventually figure out that they're broke and they're going to need real money to pay for things. And I'm looking at this over here, and this is a honeypot, and then it's pretty much end of analysis. And I don't really get into the mechanics of how they might actually try to pull it off. And what you're describing here just makes so much doesn't make sense. It's terrible. But if you're trying to predict or project what they would do next, this seems like a very viable path because it just kind of masks and hides the reality of what's actually taking place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also new for me. Like, I was like, I did write about the risk of confiscation. I just didn't really know how it would happen. And I think in general, yeah, you always want to look at what is the government doing and then what if we extrapolate it? They just keep doing it? They apply it to different industries. And I wouldn't be saying this if the government had a 10% debt to GDP, but it's 6.5% deficit. It's over $1 trillion a year now that they have to
Yeah.
pay in interest
Just interest.
payments. It's bonkers. It's
Yeah.
worse than the Great Depression, literally.
How about
Mm.
the pivot from the start of the year? When the administration came in and Elon was going to make the government efficient with Doge and all this stuff, right? It seemed like they actually were thinking that they might be able to implement austerity measures and get the whole ship under control and save it. And then it was what, May timeframe that it seemed like they did literally a 180 hard pivot and was like, okay, like this whole thing's going to hell in a handbasket. And then they really leaned into the Genius Act and like all this. And I know that they were kind of working on some of that stuff since the start of the year, but it was like they just kind of forgot about all when Elon and Bassett had their blow up, and it just like the whole thing just spun 180. Like, what are your thoughts on some of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with that analysis. Additionally, I do try to put myself in the shoes of the administration, be like, okay, what is this like from their point of view?
Yeah.
And maybe one of the things they underestimated is just it's almost like a covert civil war that's happening. Like there's just so much strife internally in the US on the international stage. There's the threat of war everywhere. That feels very imminent to these people who are trying to run the ship and trying to, first of all, yeah, not sink, trying to keep it on course more or less, trying to not get overthrown by a new, the previous more like liberal elites, like for them to come back and just take it over. Maybe in that sense, a reality check. I also feel like, yeah, Scott Bessent, it feels a bit like his confidence is just less than what it was. Like that, well, we're gonna pull this off, it's gonna be great. Doge, the $5 million, what is it called? Golden tickets that we're gonna sell to get
Yeah,
5 million people, million wealthy people in the country. All those revenue sources, I do think the tariffs is kind of going pretty well. It's going better than what people
yeah,
expected.
yeah. I would agree with that.
But it's not enough. Yeah.
Yeah,
So what are you going to do? And I think for Bitcoin savers, it's important to probably keep in mind that this is kind of a story separate from the Bitcoin price. It doesn't mean if the government gets aggressive, it's not a world government, it's the US government. 300 million people live in the US.
yeah,
There's so much money outside the US. And you saw it with Roosevelt as well when he confiscated gold, the literal gold price went up 50% in the 12 months following.
yeah.
So that's counterintuitive, but it can totally happen to Bitcoin too, where we have a raging bull market in which it's the biggest possible endorsement. Like, what is the asset that they're after? It's the most valuable asset on the world stage. So it's a huge endorsement of Bitcoin, the asset class.
Yeah. At the beginning of the year when all this was coming out, I made a video back in, it was like probably January of 2025. And I said, this is literally impossible what they're trying to do, simply because if they are like reducing the expansion of the units, they have to replace them. They have to put it, the whole thing is literally a Ponzi scheme. And if you're removing units out of that, you're going to get so much impairment across debt instruments that the market's not going to be able to handle it. There's just not going to be enough currency in the system to service the demands and the flow of commerce.
Hmm.
And it seems like they've figured that out. You write about this in your report with the M2 and how Bitcoin tracks the M2 growth rate. And back when I was talking about this, I was just looking at the M2 and I'm like, hey, they've aggressively contracted on a global scale, the M2. And they're kind of at the limits of where everywhere we've looked in the past 20 years, where the trend line has to keep going up and to the right. It was where we're at right now. So, like, I just don't see it happening. Talk to us about this idea of M2 growth and anything else that you want to kind of unpack with some of those ideas. And I guess my question to you in all of that is it really a Ponzi? Is the fiat system just a total Ponzi scheme and they have to keep expanding it or else things start melting down?
Yeah, it is, in my opinion. And I really respect you and other people who go into the nitty-gritty of like, Lynn Alden and like really understanding how it functions. But that realization back in, 2006, 7 for me was the start of trying to find an alternative place to go and finding real scarcity really because there's just more debt than can ever be serviced. So the only way to keep doing it is to extend and pretend
Roll
until
it.
you hit a wall. And that's
Yeah.
hyperinflation. And then of course the debt gets washed out and you get a huge restructuring of society. There's all these stories, of course, of people borrowing huge amounts of money in Weimar Germany and getting away with it, like just buying real asset just in the right because they had the right connection, they made the right decision at the right time. But then at the same time, you get the mass of the populace who just gets impoverished, and that's a new problem. It means they get angry, they have very little to lose. You can get revolutions, those kind of things, and then the government has to try and find a way to keep finding revenue sources just to try and keep the machine running, at least from a governance point of view. Maybe the Ponzi scheme is broke, but yeah, you got to find a way to keep it going somehow, or you have a literal civil war and the country falls apart, something like that. There's so many moving pieces, right? There's just so many moving. I'm also surprised to see how fast the international tensions are ramping up. And I think it is because, once the Ponzi scheme comes to an end, all of a sudden you realize how weak you are. And it means that, even in the past, outside forces that were considered to be weak, like these gangs or whatever, all of a sudden they can make their way in because they're profiting off of your instability. Like when Russia had their hyperinflation, it was so hard for Moscow to get even some revenue. Like Yeltsin organized a commission to figure out, like, why are the tax revenues not arriving in Moscow? What's going on? Like, we can't raise money. And what had happened is that, and this is way down the line, I'm not saying this is for tomorrow, but what had happened is that these provinces, technically, they were paying their taxes in kind because, the ruble is worthless, but it was so hard to oversee all that literally, like, for example, the province of Samara in Russia was paying taxes, quote unquote. What it was is they had filled a container with toxic waste and just literal toxic waste, like chemical waste, and send it to Moscow and be like, this is our payment, deal with it. Or like you'd have the local construction company and they would have to pay taxes, and then the city would be like, you know what? How about you guys build us a metro system? Just do that, and that we'll consider that to be your tax. So
Yeah.
it's not the end of the world, but it is a difficult environment. The money is the blood of the economy. Of course, you and I agree, there's anemia, there's all these problems. Once that really hits a certain critical point, the coordination becomes so hard in the economy. And now in the world economy, it's probably the first time that we're seeing a fiat crisis on a global scale. I don't know the details about China either, but they're probably going to run into issues with the yuan. Europe obviously is going to have issues with the euro. The yen is already toast pretty much. Now I'm seeing news that it looks like France is going to need an IMF bailout. The UK the same. Like, that's acceleration.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. Talk to us about gold. You've covered gold quite a bit through the years. Bitcoin is still not breaking out to a new all-time high against gold, which I think is an interesting discussion point. How do you kind of see the coming 5 years with Bitcoin and gold and how it's kind of treated on the international stage with all this institutional adoption happening now on Bitcoin?
Yeah, this is a little pet peeve of mine, and maybe looking back, it'll be some kind of bizarre coincidence, but when I look at the Bitcoin chart expressed in gold, I see these psychological points of resistance, 1 gram of gold, 1 ounce of gold, 100 grams of gold, and now 1 kilo, 1,000 grams of gold. We hit that point in 2020, and now 5 years later, we're still at a kilo of gold. And so I do think we're going to break above that just because Bitcoin is more provably scarce than gold. There's a lot more you can do with it. It's not as geographically constrained. It's more auditable, all that stuff that we all know. And so, yeah, I do think it'll be very meaningful once Bitcoin breaks up in terms of gold. I think the next obvious target is 10, 11 kilograms of gold because, 10 is maybe a psychological target, but, or maybe like 12 kilos. And then people estimate that 11 kilos of gold is pretty much parity for Bitcoin in terms of market cap. So if we hit 11 kilos, then the gold market cap and Bitcoin market cap are going to be the same. So that would be an excellent next point of resistance where people just, they don't think it'll go above that. Maybe eventually, of course, I think it will, but for the coming cycle, or for the coming, 24 months even, that might be an interesting target. So yeah, I think it's very important to look at those graphs because it's become impossible to look at long dated charts expressed in dollars. I can't see rhyme or reason in them. They're all just going parabolic because the denominator is being destroyed.
Do gold bugs look at that chart? Or is this Bitcoiners that pretty much look at that
I
chart?
think somehow they have to, that 1 ounce resistance, that was also a 3-year resistance. That was not, not a small potato type thing. That was a big deal. I remember, in 2014, people were really talking about, Bitcoin at 1 ounce of gold, and this is important and meaningful. And I do think gold bugs, at least the informed ones, probably the movers and the shakers, why wouldn't you? That's been a tradition, a long-standing tradition in the gold world, is to express all kinds of asset classes in terms of gold and to look at resistance and support and those kind of things. So my bet would be yes, absolutely. Like maybe not every retail investor, but I think the long-term, very dedicated gold investors are looking at Bitcoin in terms of gold.
So something that you and I have talked about for what feels like almost a decade is this difference between Bitcoin and crypto. And I guess now that we have nation states involved and a potential adoption, Eric Trump was, I guess, on stage saying that there was some nation state out there that bought tens of thousands worth of coins. How damaging, in your opinion, is the conflation of the two for Bitcoin's political acceptance moving forward?
Well, I mean, the more they are conflated, Bitcoin and all these centralized crypto coins, the more you can try and sell the illusion that Bitcoin is just another fiat currency and that it's the same thing, and so that anybody can just be a victim of the endless pump and dump and dilution. Because, a centralized coin, it can very easily be influenced by political actors who do have the guns and the intelligence and everything. So even if you're like, oh, but yes, we're 10 guys, but we're spread around the world. It's like, it's not that hard for an intelligence agency to track those people down and say, hey, let's partner up. Kind of like how the mafia, knocks on your door as a shopkeeper and be like, let us protect you. So I do think these, crypto coins are going to stay in existence. Hopefully, the separation is going to continue. I think Bitcoin dominance is just so huge now. I feel that people are seeing Bitcoin increasingly as a conservative investment, and they're not saying that about Ether or Cardano or any of the other coins. Those are not conservative investments. So I just feel like that fits in the zeitgeist where the whole world is looking for safety. Like, what is safe? What is permanent? What is universal? What is apolitical? And Bitcoin fits that to a T. Of course, now, interestingly, within Bitcoin, we're starting to have that debate of like, hey, like, are these latest upgrades, is that actually conservative? Should we be doing that? But I think that's just a sign of the times, that kind of the speculative mania type zeitgeist versus the newer counterculture of conservatism.
Yeah. One of my frustrations with the institutions and Wall Street showing up right now is I haven't seen or heard anybody from those institutions really kind of laying out Bitcoin, especially as they're comparing it to, call it Ethereum or Solana or any of these other things. They don't get into any of the tech or why it's more decentralized or why it's more secure at all. It's just kind of like a wave of the hand. Here's Bitcoin, here's these other blockchains. We think you, and they're clearly incentivized to just sell product. They just want to sell ETFs that, are wrappers on top of all of these things. And so maybe the reason we're seeing that is they're incentivized to just kind of like not really get into it because they have more to sell.
Sure, but then again, they're no longer the Wall Street is no longer the only game in town. Like they might believe that, they might want to believe that, but look at Tether. They're making more profit than JP Morgan.
Yeah.
The new generation is here and they don't need to live in New York City
Hmm.
to the extent that they will, that Wall Street will just continue on this road. It'll just be digging its own grave.
Yeah.
Similar to how London was supposedly the financial heart of Europe and everything is happening from there. And maybe there is still that to an extent, but it feels increasingly like it's a kind of a pretend thing. Like it's already gone. Like people have already given up on London. So, New York has that risk as well. And I think that, that's a little bit of the Achilles heel that maybe Trump has, is that he grew up in that environment. He has that New York DNA of just like deal making and whatever's moving, like we want to be involved in that. And of course, there's a lot to be admired about the entrepreneurial spirit, but doing the 10,000 hour type study of, one particular platform or technology,
Hmm.
that's usually not really part of the New York mentality, I would say.
Yeah, my frustration, and we talk about this on the show quite a bit, is just like when you look at the Lightning Network and you look at if Bitcoin layer one is optimized for decentralization and security and not optimized for scalability, and this is the trilemma that we're talking about here, the scalability is pushed off into subsequent layers that are above it. When you do go to those subsequent layers, The scalability is the thing that shines when you get into the layer two, and it still comes with the security and decentralization of layer one. And so when I'm looking at all of these stable coins, and we had Tether back in January say that they were going to try to use, I believe, the Taproot Asset Protocol from Lightning Labs to issue Tether on Bitcoin Lightning, it's going to move faster. It's going to have lower fees. It's going to have the decentralization of the node network and not four people running a quote unquote full node. It's going to have tens of thousands of nodes that are running and having the reliability and all of that that comes with it. And so I'm looking at it and I'm saying long term, it just doesn't make sense to me that something that has better incentives would lose. I'm assuming you agree with that, but do you? And are we just impatient? Do we just need to give this more time for real world assets being tokenized on top of Lightning being a better use case with no native token, unlike Ethereum, Solana, Tron, you name it?
There's a test phase that kind of needs to happen. And I think there was a little bit of overexcitement maybe early on about Lightning. I think it was not realistic to think that everybody would just run a Lightning node and do it well enough to keep doing it. Similar to maybe early on, people thought anyone is just going to run an email server, their own email server in their basement.
Bitcoin mining has a reputation for being impersonal, risky, and full of hidden fees. But one company is flipping that script, and it's Abundant Mines. Abundant Mines was founded by Bo and Christine Marie Turner, two Bitcoiners who lost over $500,000 to mining providers that overpromised and underdelivered. Instead of walking away, they built the company they wish had existed when they first started mining. With Abundant Mines, clients actually own their machines. And in Oregon, they come with no sales tax. There's one flat monthly fee for hosting, no surprise repair invoices, and if a rig ever goes down, their system redirects hash power so your earnings don't miss a beat. But what really stands out is how personal the experience is. Every client gets direct support, ongoing education, and guidance from a real human being who lives and breathes this mission, so you never have to be left guessing. In addition, through 100% bonus depreciation, mining can offer major tax advantages that you don't get by just buying Bitcoin. Their clients describe it like acquiring Bitcoin for half price when factoring in the returns and the write-offs. They've put together a thoughtful gift just for listeners of this show that could potentially save you thousands of dollars. There's no pressure, just something to help you think through if mining is actually right for you. So if this is something you're curious about and you want to learn more, you can check it out at abundantmines.com/Preston. That's abundantmines.com/Preston.
So yeah, you need to kind of build that infrastructure. It does seem maybe that Lightning needs to be interoperable with one or more other protocols to really become like that performant juggernaut. And that also takes time to do it well. We need people that have the knowledge and the risk appetite to invest in those companies and make it happen. So I'm not surprised it's been, I think 2016 was the Lightning paper maybe. So I'm not surprised it's been 9 years. Also because the real trunk of Bitcoin is that store of value property. Like that is the real kind of the root, the strong foundation of it all. And then the branches and the leaves, like that's more retail, that's more that high speed stuff. But I do think, especially now that we're seeing the middle class is kind of disappearing, something that used to be very easy, like, oh, pay $20 for a wire transfer, wait for 4 days for the money to arrive. Maybe younger people, especially, are not going to be willing to endure that anymore or just not be able to afford it anymore. So, maybe those people will just kind of become Bitcoin natives increasingly. But that's then also a generational thing. So that takes some time as well. Like boomers are not going to run their own, their own nodes, but they still have the majority of the money in the economy for now. I keep saying it, but next year, boomers are going to be between age 62 and 80 years old. So it's really kind of getting to that point where they're going to be liquidating, they're going to be gifting, sometimes just to stay afloat, sometimes just to kind of do family planning. That's coming in the next 5 to 10 years, especially if the pain in real estate keeps increasing.
Yeah. Speaking of pain, What institutions or industries do you think will be most disrupted coming in the next 5 years, 10 years? Uh,
You mean within Bitcoin, or what do you
Within
mean in
Bitcoin,
general?
and also I think when you combine that with AI, what are we in for coming here in the next 5 years as far as disruption goes?
From the highest possible level, yes, I do think robotics is going to be huge. Like you're just seeing what they can do. Like really, they can get into human environments and just take over. Like the work that I used to do as a job student in a factory, like you can just put a machine there. But at the same time, they are maybe more vulnerable to supply chain disruption, those kind of things. Like you have to maintain the robots, you have to get all the parts, and then what if there's trade wars happening where there's delays? Like if you wanted to do business in Latin America, you were facing all those problems even in the past 50 years. So I think it's important to not put your rose-colored glasses on too much of like, oh, robotics is going to solve it all. Especially if look at the U.S. There's so much stuff that is not being produced here anymore, and maybe we'll lose access. So I don't think the boom in blue collar jobs is going to be stopped by AI or robotics anytime soon. Like definitely the next 10 years, I think we're just going to see more and more people get into welding, get into, all these kind of productive production type jobs, maybe go back to agriculture to an extent. Also because the core of the economic machine is just going to be focused on that more. Like people just won't be able to afford so much, a cruise ship or a Netflix or those kind of things. It's tightening the belts. So that's kind of the macro idea. Um, and then what new things are coming up?
Yeah.
I do think, mining and AI is a marriage made in heaven. Like, these data centers, like they can just switch from one to the other if they're close to a cheap energy source, if they have political stability on a relatively around them, they can really flourish. And we can even see, new towns, new cities be built around that. That's going to be huge. I think there will be new financial centers around the world. I'm not really sure where yet. It's a little bit kind of wait and see. Like I was looking into maybe this sounds a bit overly dramatic, but when Rome fell, wealthy people, elites, they had to go somewhere. And so there was a flourishing of the city called Ravenna. It was kind of in the area of Venice, but it was protected by the coast on the one hand, and on the other hand, the mountains, and then also the river. I think it was the Po River. So they kind of built this city in a swamp. So, very kind of unintuitive, like, oh, it wasn't the obvious answer, but it just kind of gradually became the answer to these bigger centers. And so who knows where I think in the US there's a lot of room. So, who knows? Maybe it's the Appalachian Mountains, or maybe I don't know. Like, and it doesn't mean that everyone's gonna live, on a farm or something. Like we could actually have cities that start to flourish in unexpected places. So I'm just kind of open for that. That's why I've been trying to follow Argentina as well. Like that might be an area where a lot of capital could find its way eventually if they can maintain their stability in some way. I mean, people have been betting on El Salvador to an extent. I don't know how sustainable that is. But yeah, so because there's so much inertia with these big centers that are built around a different philosophy that I don't think it'll be very easy to just say we're going to revive New York. New York is going to, we're just going to pivot New York, and it's going to be, I don't know. There's just so much inertia there that I
Seems
think
like
it'll be hard.
the simpler, the more opportunity there is. Like,
Right, because you want to be in from if you're a Bitcoiner, you're like, let's punt some money there and let the younger people build it out, and then we'll kind of join them. And but yeah, and then specifically industry wise, I mean, I've long been bullish on the insurance sector. Like I think it also fits in that people want stability. There is that more conservative mindset nowadays. So how do you protect your family? It's going to be life insurance, deposit insurance, those kind of things. Very boring sounding, but an insurance sector that's built around paying out claims in dollars might not be sustainable if we're going to get 30-40% annual dollar inflation. So I think that's really going to need reinvention, and it's already happening. We're starting the beginning of that. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what areas are you looking at?
your point on if there's natural resources, particularly on the energy domain,
Mm,
that's huge.
mm,
Just because of the data centers and the Bitcoin mining and just kind of what energy means at its core, right? But you also have to have the policy and the government domain that's on the wrapper on top of that, that is wide open saying, yes, come here. Like it's whatever you can build, whatever you can capture and kill, it's yours kind of thing. And when you look at cities that are very established, you mentioned New York, right? Um, I look at the policy and procedures of some of these cities, and I'm saying they are going to have a very hard time competing, I think, in the coming decade or two, just because they're just not going to be agile to how fast all of this is changing and like what incentives they need to be putting in place to attract the future businesses and what they're looking to do. And so I think the simplicity, if it's got a lot of energy and it's got a government with, policies that are like, yeah, come on in here and do what you will, I think they're going to crush it. I think they're going to be really like far out in front.
I think
And
Singapore has been a great example, something that's already been shown and proven.
yeah,
When entrepreneurs would come to Singapore, they would be so surprised that like all of a sudden you get a visit from the government and it's not like, how can we extract all the possible value out of you, but
out
it's
of
more like, what can we do for you? How can we help
help.
you? Like, what do you need? We want you here. The Singapore government, they would travel abroad and like, have these diplomatic missions. I remember early on visiting Kathy Wood in her little New York office. This is like before they blew up. And she had to cut short my meeting because she was meeting the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, who were like,
Wow.
coming to visit.
Yeah. Yeah. Because they're out there doing outreach, right? Yeah.
Because it's a that's the thing. It's a young place. People
Mhm.
like the founders are still alive,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think that's going to be huge. Hey, so at the end of your report, you compare Bitcoin to the power of the piece, and you have this artwork channeling
Mm.
technology towards order and harmony. And Bitcoiners are known for saying Bitcoin solves everything. But in this case, do you genuinely believe Bitcoin can reduce global conflict? Or is this just inspirational
I
hope?
know, I do think so. Yeah, I really do think so. It can reduce global conflict. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and also it's going to be the stage for this enormous wealth redistribution that we're seeing. So we're basically going to have, new kings are going to be made, and then of course it's up to those kings to make it happen. Like you can't just assume they're going to be great guys. Like we're going to have to kind of try and be vigilant and because to an extent it won't just be the kings who decide, like, I'm the king now. Like, it'll be because there is a critical mass of people who believe in them and their project. And so that's why, when I look back at that edge from Vedics from back in I think it's like the late 1500s, they don't just show technology and being like, oh, swords and the plowshares, and then we had this big furnace in the middle. The main characters are the virtues. So you see like fortitude and justice, so they're personifying the moral virtues that are needed to make all that happen. Yeah, you see in the sky, you see peace and justice. And so, yeah, it has to be a collaborative effort. Like we're going to have to, to the extent that we're critical of previous generations of like, they messed up. It wasn't just because they had the wrong technology. It was also because there was a laxness, there was an indifference towards universal moral values. And so I think that's why, trying to go back to the origins of Bitcoin, the cypherpunks, like that was a really moral project. And so I think that's the rabbit hole to keep going into or the source to keep tapping into is like, and I think thin libertarianism probably is not enough. Like I think property rights are very important, but it probably won't be enough to really kind of have a real renaissance, like a kind of a revitalization of society. But it's a fantastic start.
Yeah. I love when you put some of this artwork out there. You
Mm.
you are a master at finding like awesome stuff from the past to kind of show the correlation and hope we can.
Way less of a master than the actual artist, but yeah.
All right. Well, Tuur, we're going to have links to the report. Anything else that you want to highlight, and we'll have a link to your Twitter account where you're active, or your X account.
I mean, I have a couple episodes still coming out on my podcast, but I'll publish that. It's just it's still exciting, to be in the Bitcoin ecosystem and to I think in a way we were often annoyed at these cycles, like people are so ignorant and then they get overexcited. It's like, but still, it's been a great gym to just kind of use personally to not get overly invested in the price too much and try to keep a long-term perspective. So I do feel grateful for all that. And then also just it's interesting how with the Bitcoin development, just to see again, like that moral debate is like, okay, what is Bitcoin actually about? Is it about these financial transactions and storing them as best as possible in a very lean ledger? Or is it an agnostic ledger where we should be able to put anything? Like the tools that people use to debate are, yeah, I mean, superficially, it's all technological arguments, but ultimately, it's about that moral argument of like, okay, what is this really about? What is the higher goal of this entire project? So that's just very fascinating still and important.
Yeah. Well, we'll have links to the things that we mentioned there in the show notes. Tuur, thank you so much for making time. And I obviously look forward to the next time we can chat.
Always a pleasure, Preston. Always a pleasure.
This is something in insurance and in gambling. I used to play poker. This concept of risk of ruin. You never want to be in a position where one assumption falls apart and it has this larger cascading effect, irreparable loss. That is what we're mitigating around. These different keys, these different setups, you having a named policy, being able to have this comprehensive set of coverage. I think this is just an obvious step as the ecosystem and capital formation matures. Like with all of these treasury companies I've talked about, like it's almost like the initial capitalization of Bitcoin banks.